Welcome to Polk's America, a podcast produced by the President James K. Polk Home and Museum in Columbia, Tennessee. I'm your host, Thomas Samuel. When you think of conspiracy theory, what comes to mind? The moon landing? The Kennedy assassination? Roswell? Or maybe it's something more recent, like Pizzagate. Either way, it seems conspiracy theory is as American as apple pie. New conspiracies seem to form as quickly as the memes created to spread them on social media. We tend to think of conspiracy theory as some phenomenon born of the 20th century, but the roots go much deeper. On this episode of Polk's America, our guest is Dr. Erik Schmeller of Tennessee State University. His presentation, Conspiracy, Slavery, and the Great American Land Pirate, explores some of the roots of American conspiracy theory through the supposed slave power conspiracy and the examination of legendary outlaw John Murrell.
So on January 30th, 1835, Andrew Jackson became the first president to experience an assassination attempt. An unemployed house painter named Richard Lawrence had two loaded pistols which both misfired. Onlookers were so shocked, most remained frozen after the first firing. But shortly after the second shot, Jackson had moved toward the would-be assassin, of course with his cane raised. A naval officer, actually, that was present was the first to subdue Lawrence. Under interrogation, Lawrence explained that he had lost his job recently. And at one point, he had been employed as a painter at the White House. He had become convinced, based on recent published reports in the more partisan Whig papers, otherwise known as the Anti-Jackson Party, that because of Jackson's, quote, war on the Bank of the United States, he and others were suffering, and without Jackson, money would be more plenty. Upon further questioning, Lawrence also explained that he was the rightful heir to the throne of England, had regular contact with other monarchs in Europe, and obviously he was institutionalized, and remained institutionalized until his death in 1865. So the roots of a conspiracy began almost immediately after that attempt. Rumors that Lawrence had recently been seen at the home of Mississippi Senator George Poindexter, a vocal critic of Jackson, began to spread. Jackson supposedly had also commented to bystanders that Lawrence was, quote, likely hired by that damned rascal Poindexter to assassinate me. A congressional investigation followed shortly after the attempt, but failed to draw any such conclusions. The Washington Globe continued to fuel the conspiracy by suggesting that John C. Calhoun and his 1832 speech, shortly after Jackson had been reelected, was a not-so-subtle foreshadowing of the 1835 assassination attempt on Jackson. In that speech, Calhoun famously compared Jackson to Caesar, and Calhoun had noted, quote, the actors in our case are of a different character, artful, cunning, and corrupt politicians, not fearless warriors. They have entered the treasury, not sword in hand as public plunderers, but with the false keys of sophistry. Obviously, readers at the time would know what happened to Caesar on the Ides of March.
After 1835, conspiracy theories surrounding the Jackson assassination attempt remained. But it wasn't until 1864, when John Smith Dye published The Adder's Den, or Secrets of the Great Conspiracy to Overthrow Liberty in America, that the theories took on a life of their own. Dye's book asserts many wild claims and attributes the attempt on Jackson, along with other supposedly successful secret assassinations, to a powerful pro-slavery group consisting of the South's largest slave owners and their political allies.
As the U.S. was entering the final years of its Civil War and the clarity that the war was being waged to end slavery, the book imagined an expansive conspiracy stretching back to Jackson and efforts of the slave power to resist any efforts to limit or end slavery. Jackson had made himself a target by asserting federal authority over the states with the nullification crisis. Now added to the list of targets was President William Henry Harrison, who supposedly told Calhoun he was not willing to annex Texas. According to Dye, and we all know William Henry Harrison did not stay around very long, his death a month after becoming president in 1841, as Dye would say, was due to arsenic poisoning. In 1850, President Zachary Taylor dared oppose the slave power agenda in Cuba and the recently acquired Southwest Territories. He would also be poisoned, according to Dye, by arsenic. Taylor was most likely died from cholera, exacerbated by gastroenteritis. In February of 1857, 2 months before being inaugurated as the 15th president, James Buchanan failed, supposedly, to fully support the slave power. So agents poisoned all the bowls containing lump sugar at the National Hotel in Washington, D.C. And the question obviously is why? What a random way to try and kill a future president. And this is where it kind of gets funny, as with most conspiracies. The argument that Dye puts forward, Southerners drink coffee and they use pulverized sugar, whereas Northerners drink tea and use lump or cube sugar. Very detailed there. So according to Dye, Buchanan became deathly sick and barely survived. After that, Buchanan then, after he'd been threatened, towed the line as the slave power dictated. The problem is, of course, the facts. Buchanan was not in Washington, D.C. at the time Dye claims this attempt occurred. As often occurs with conspiracies, there's just enough truth in the story to complicate it for some. There was an outbreak of dysentery at the hotel when Buchanan was there in January, and again at inauguration time. All of this was to serve as a warning to then President Lincoln of the dangers of the slave power. And when Dye published the book again in 1866, the recent assassination of Lincoln fed even more interest.
Many Americans read The Adder's Den and believed. Why? Christopher French of Goldsmiths, University of London, explains that cognitive biases play a part, and confirmation bias is perhaps the most powerful driver. We all tend to give more weight to evidence that supports our beliefs and ignore evidence that contradicts. Additionally, proportionality bias leads us to believe that big events must have big causes, meaning something like the unfortunate death of President Zachary Taylor could not be the work of a common natural cause like cholera, but instead it was the work of shadowy assassins carrying out the wishes of a vast slave conspiracy. But what else? What specifically about Polk's time fed the rise of conspiracy theory?
So some of the themes during Polk's America that tend to fuel conspiracy based on some current research. Religious fervor and fear. This is the time period of the Great Awakening, with the growth of the Mormon Church is certainly a big part of that, and obviously Finney's famous revivals in Rochester. So the religious upheaval, usually we talk about spiritual questioning. How are we finding answers for what's happening in and around us? That feeds conspiracy. Nostalgia for the past in some ways. Looking back to a time period for a lot of Americans that this was kind of the birth of the American national identity. And that certainly plays a part in this. Some of the opposition to the women's movement as well during this time period, I think, comes from this nostalgia for the past. Obviously, we have the Seneca Falls Convention happening. The economic uncertainty of the time period. So obviously the Panic of 1837, and then the rise in cotton prices, and obviously the gold rush. The ups and downs of the time period create an economic instability. And finally, the nationally divisive issues of this fascinating time period, the rise of the anti-slavery movements, slave rebellions, most famously Nat Turner's revolt, the actual Indian removal, which I know we're all familiar with being here in Tennessee, and the issue of immigration. All of these kinds of combined national issues really does obviously kind of feed into what I'm trying to talk about with conspiracy.
On the road to Tuscaloosa, all the riders know me well. They whisper around the firelight tales of John Murrell. And having heard their stories, and I'll swear they're mostly true, but if you'd like to know some more, I'll tell the rest to you.
Near Jackson, Tennessee, in Madison County, there's a historical marker at the intersection of Airways Boulevard and Technology Center Drive. It reads, 8 miles south lived the notorious bandit and outlaw. Born 1804 in Williamson County, leader of the Mystic Clan, he fomented slave insurrections and terrorized the lower Mississippi Valley for years. He died at Pikeville in 1844 after serving a prison term for slave stealing. His unsavory career has been considerably embellished through legend and fiction.
And his plundering occupation, no, my mother taught me fine.
So, on to Murrell. The second conspiracy of the antebellum period I'm focusing on is one that has a much broader impact both socially and artistically than the slave power conspiracy. It's also one that James K. Polk and his contemporaries would have been very familiar with in Middle Tennessee and West Tennessee. Augustus Q. Walton, Virgil Stewart's pen name, so for the entire time, I'm just going to refer to him as Virgil Stewart, would write a book in 1835, so a year after Murrell has actually been put in jail, that broadly captured the attention of Americans and had a particularly deadly impact in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Not much is known of the motives of Stewart other than to make money off the story of the recently imprisoned slave and horse-stealing John Murrell. The Murrell of Stewart's book had masterminded a vast criminal network in West Tennessee, large parts of Mississippi and the Arkansas Territory. His Mystic Clan consisted of hundreds of members spread among all of the slave states and at every level of society. Murrell himself, of course, willingly gives all of the details of his family, previous crimes, and grand plans as what would become known as the Great Western Land Pirate to Virgil Stewart as he rides with him south-southwest from Madison County in January of 1834. We learn that prior to this, Murrell had traveled throughout the South and into South America briefly. Trained by a, quote, circuit preacher among the Methodists, he was as slick on the tongue as goose grease. While touring South America, Murrell, quote, passed as a doctor and also converted to Catholicism before he robbed, quote, an old Catholic of $900. It was a time of religious uncertainty and growth thanks to the Second Great Awakening, and it's interesting that Murrell supposedly took advantage of the influx of itinerant preachers to his own profit. Ultimately, we're left with a picture of a man who doesn't really respect any faith. This is a minor theme in the book, as Murrell's true talent was in slave stealing. Of course, like any good supervillain, Murrell reveals the nature of his secret Mystic Clan to Stewart. So he describes this, and Virgil Stewart, in his introduction, he basically says, well, I lied and gave him a false name so I could ride with him and join his gang, but always working undercover to find out what was happening and actually recover a horse for a parson who'd had it stolen earlier.
In Virgil Stewart's book, The Life and Adventures of John A. Murrell, the bandit and the incognito author ride along together. Virgil Stewart wins Murrell's trust and extracts information on the workings of Murrell's gang known as the Mystic Clan. And like so many conspiracy theories, a mysterious cabal emerges. The most powerful and secretive are the leaders known as the Grand Council. Murrell, according to Stewart, claims half of this council are powerful men of means who could wield their power to keep their secrets safe. Dr. Schmeller quotes,
"Should anything leak out by chance, these men would crush it at once by ridiculing the idea and fears of the people." And here, obviously, Murrell is referencing many of the slave rebellions of the time period would be uncovered before they actually occurred. Doors Rebellion, there's numerous smaller ones, but that was always a danger. So here Stewart has created a story where within the conspiracy there's a group that's going to act as a anti-conspiracy. They're out there basically to give, I hate to, fake news, essentially, when it does happen. The second class are those whom we trust with nothing only that which they are immediately concerned with. We have them to do what we are not willing to do ourselves. They always stand between us and danger. This class is what we term the strikers. We have about 400 of the Grand Council and near 650 strikers. Now, interestingly enough, in the book, Murrell never actually enumerates how many slaves he has as part of the larger part, because that was the part that kind of reach out to the slaves and tell them, you rebel, join with us, we'll help you out, and we will get your freedom. The grand object that we have in contemplation, as the quote kind of says here, is to excite rebellion among the Negroes throughout the slaveholding states. Our plan is to manage it so as to have it commence everywhere at the same hour. We have set 25th December, 1835.
So what exactly are they planning? On Christmas Day, 1835, the Mystic Klan, after inciting a coordinated slave rebellion throughout the country, will ride into each town, setting it ablaze. While each town is engaged in its own self-defense, the strikers rob the banks and merchants. Murrell and the Klan get rich while the world burns.
So while Murrell would appear to be an abolitionist when recruiting the enslaved to his plan, his true motivation was wealth and to punish the wealthy and powerful. This was also a time of significant growth of the abolitionist movement, with a similarly significant amount of disinformation about the goals and objectives of abolitionists and free soilers. This is also the time when the anti-slavery movement was sending through the mail materials, and that had kind of really amped up this anxiety. When faced with such a large and divisive issue, conspiracy theories have a very fertile ground to grow and spread. Murrell supposedly told Stewart, who he had taken into his confidence by now as a fellow potential member and thief, that he had over 1,000 members and was expected to reach 2,000 by December 25th. At that time, slaves would rise all over the entire South, and while rebelling, Murrell and his Mystic Klan would rob and steal indiscriminately. Readers of the time would be very familiar with Nat Turner's revolt in 1831, when over 50 slave owners and family members were killed. When the authorities regained control after Christmas, Murrell and his followers would retreat to a massive hollow tree hideout in the swamp. Stewart also seems to borrow from the confessions of Nat Turner, where a local lawyer interviewed Turner from his jail cell and took some liberties with Turner's words.
In short, Virgil Stewart's book fed into pro-slavery Americans' preconceived notions about abolitionism and slave insurrection. Murrell became a boogeyman, the embodiment of both fears and bias confirmed. This dangerous mix had real-world consequences. After the publishing of The Life and Adventures of John A. Murrell, communities along the Mississippi worried that Stewart's fabrication was true. A series of violent outbursts, known as the Murrell excitements, proved deadly.
And in Vicksburg, Mississippi, we have at least, that we know of, 5, and they were just called gamblers, were lynched July 5th, 1835, for fear of being part of the Mystic Klan and still operating in the area. Any transient white man, and that included preachers, because Murrell had then also worn that hat, were viewed with suspicion and essentially told to get out of town.
The Murrell excitements were proof of the very real danger that conspiracy theories represent. Stewart's land pirate was a larger-than-life fictional character that became real in the minds of some readers. But John A. Murrell was a real man, a criminal, but not a mastermind.
So Murrell, the real Murrell, we know was born in Southern Virginia. Murrell's family moved to Williamson County, Tennessee in 1806, where they purchased land from John Donaldson. The family did not come to Tennessee in significant financial difficulty, as they owned 3 slaves and were able to purchase land. But after the death of the father, Jeffrey Murrell, the family's financial difficulties became public record. In his will, Jeffrey had disinherited his oldest son, who had legal difficulties of larceny, debt, and forgery. The rest of the 4 sons were similarly inclined. The youngest son was described by a grand jury as a man of, quote, lewd habits and evil conversation. John Murrell himself, the future land pirate, had his first significant run-in with the law in 1823 at the age of 16. He was charged with riot, or as we know it, disturbing the peace. In 1826, he was arrested again for stealing a neighbor's horse. He managed to escape his cell and was later recaptured and tried in Nashville. He was sentenced at that point to a public whipping of 30 lashes, 2 hours in a public pillory, a branding of his thumb with HT, or horse thief, and then 12 months in jail. This is one of the more morbidly unique aspects of Murrell's story, as the Tennessee State Museum has in its collection a mummified thumb that at the time was purported to be Murrell's, but it lacks a brand on it.
Gross. When I learned that the Tennessee State Museum keeps a mummified thumb in its collection, I knew I had to ask the president, James K. Polk Home and Museum curator, Candace Candido, about it. Lucky for me, she had just seen it while doing research in Nashville.
So the State Museum has in storage a human thumb, and it's in its own little custom-built coffin-shaped box, and this thumb was supposedly removed from the body of John Murrell. It is this truly awful-looking thing. It's kind of a yellowish-green color, very, I guess, mummified. It has this big yellow fingernail. I mean, it's really horrific. And the story was that this was the thumb of the notorious John Murrell, which is why it was collected and why it is today in a museum. But historians now actually believe that the thumb was just taken off of a cadaver, and that some medical student had invented this whole story. But really, it almost doesn't matter that this isn't actually John Murrell's thumb. And in fact, in some ways, it drives home this point, that Murrell was so feared and so notorious, and that this folklore surrounding him was so strong, that people would desire to attach his name to this sort of morbid and grotesque artifact, even if they have to completely make up the story to do it.
After 1835, the Murrell excitement died down. Christmas passed without incident, but the mystery and conspiracy remained fresh in the minds of Americans. The legend of the great American land pirate continued to grow. Depictions of Murrell appear in plays, books, movies, and songs into the 21st century. Each year, around Halloween, tourists visit the Tennessee State Museum to gawk at the little green thumb in its tiny coffin, a macabre parallel to the true ending of John A. Murrell's story.
Murrell is released in 1827. He moves to Wayne County, gets married, has 2 children, but continues his criminal activities, primarily stealing slaves. When captured in 1834, he was put on trial under very odd circumstances, with only one person offering testimony on Murrell's guilt, Virgil Stewart. As historian James Pennock suggests, the jury was reticent to convict on all counts, including a murder charge, because Murrell's, quote, rascally reputation was so well known in the vicinity. So Nashville, Franklin, everyone knew him and just knew he was one of those local characters, but found it really hard to believe that he was behind a mass criminal conspiracy. So it would have been a hung jury, but the judge refused to accept that decision from the jury. Murrell then would serve 10 years of hard labor at the new Tennessee State Penitentiary. Murrell, in the meantime, became a regular tourist attraction in Nashville, as travelers familiar with the legend of Murrell would stop by the prison, probably grease some palms, get to go into the prison and stare at him in his cell. By the time Murrell was finally released from prison in 1844, he had contracted tuberculosis and would die in Pikeville, Tennessee.
When you think of conspiracy theory, what comes to mind? Is it John Murrell, Roswell, the Kennedy assassination? What does it mean to be a nation of conspiracy theorists? Here's Dr. Schmeller.
So while the conspiracy of the Great Western Land Pirates certainly has its entertainment value, it also reveals the real and significant damage this kind of conspiracy can do. Today we must contend with almost instantaneous communication of ideas presented as reality or truth through the internet and multiple social media platforms. The tendencies of many people to accept conspiracies as viable is an unfortunate and depressing reality. Both the slave power and the Murrell conspiracies serve to play on the fears of an often white minority population in parts of Mississippi. It also undermined the abolitionist cause, as supposedly revealing them at root a group purely interested in enriching themselves. When faced with such large, nationally divisive issues like slavery, and we add in significant economic upheavals as well as religious awakenings, it is clear people are looking for answers. Oftentimes, those answers are generated subconsciously or for entertainment value. They can take on a life of their own, and the Murrell conspiracy remains one of the largest and longest-lived conspiracies from Polk's America.
There's at least 200 stories more the likes of I could tell. And at least 200 mothers curse the name of John Murrell. From the shores of Alabama to the western Texas skies, I'll haunt these trails and byways. I'm a master of disguise. But I was born to an honest farmer in 1809, and his plundering occupation, though my mother taught me fine, though my mother taught me fine.
Thank you for listening to Polk's America, a podcast produced by the President James K. Polk Home and Museum in Columbia, Tennessee. Today's guests have been Dr. Erik Schmeller and Candace Candido. I'm your host, Thomas Samuel. The Ballad of John Murrell was used with permission from the Andy Owens Project. It's available on iTunes and other streaming services.